I know this is going to sound like something you'd read in a story. I almost wish it were. It was a Tuesday morning in early February when my son called. Not a text, not an email. A real phone call which already told me something was off. Raymond didn't call unless something was wrong or something was about to be. I had just come in from checking the gutters on the east side of the house, something my wife Carol used to nag me about every winter before she passed, and I was standing in the kitchen pulling off my work gloves when the phone rang. "Hey, Dad." His voice had that particular flatness to it. The kind a man uses when he's already rehearsed what he's going to say, and he's hoping you won't ask too many questions. "Hey, son, what's going on?" A pause. Then, "Brianna and I are in a bit of a situation. The condo deal fell through. Something with the inspection, and the landlord won't extend the lease past the 15th. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. The garden Carol planted along the back fence had gone dormant for winter, but I'd been tending it every year since she passed. 6 years now. "How far out is the 15th? I asked. "10 days. I didn't say anything right away. I waited. The way you do when you already know what's coming, and you want to see if the other person has the decency to say it plainly. He didn't. It was Brianna who got on the line. I hadn't even heard her in the background. "Frank," she said, "not Dad, not Mr. Calloway, just Frank. The way you'd address a coworker you were mildly inconveniencing. We were hoping we could come stay with you, just while we get the new place sorted. A few weeks, maybe a month. Nothing major. Nothing major." I looked around the kitchen. Carol's handwriting was still on a recipe card tucked into the little wooden holder beside the stove, the same one she used to make her chicken pot pie every November. I had not moved that card in 6 years. "All right," I said. "Come on. That was my first mistake." Not saying it, meaning it without conditions. They arrived that Friday with 3 carloads of boxes, 2 rolling suitcases, a storage ottoman that wouldn't fit through my front door until Raymond took the legs off, and a very large houseplant I had definitely not agreed to. Raymond shook my hand at the door. Brianna kissed me on the cheek and breezed past into the living room like she was walking through a hotel lobby she'd already booked. That first weekend, I told myself it was just adjustment. New people in a space, everyone finding their rhythm. I made coffee in the mornings, kept to myself in the evenings, gave them the guest room and the hall bathroom and plenty of space to breathe. I was trying to be easy. I know what it's like to be broke and cornered. Carol and I had our own years like that early on. But by Sunday evening, Brianna had reorganized my pantry. I came into the kitchen to make dinner and found my shelves rearranged by what she called flow. My cast iron skillet, the one I've used for 31 years, the one my own father handed me when I got my first apartment, had been moved to the bottom cabinet because it was too heavy for the rack. Carol's recipe card holder had been pushed to the far end of the counter to make room for a fruit bowl we didn't own before. Friday, I put everything back without saying a word. On Monday, I came downstairs to find Brianna at the kitchen table with a laptop open and a notepad beside it, writing in neat, precise columns. She looked up when I walked in and smiled the smile of someone who is about to give you information you didn't ask for. "I put together a little schedule," she said, "just so we're all on the same page about the house." She slid the notepad across the table. At the top, in letters she'd underlined twice, "Household expectations." Below it, a numbered list. Breakfast cleared by 8. Common areas vacuumed on Tuesdays and Fridays. Guest towels in the hall bathroom, she had labeled them guest towels to be washed every 3 days. Noise after 9:30 p.m. to be kept to a minimum because she was a light sleeper. I read the whole list. Twice. Then I looked at Raymond. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee with the studied focus of a man who has decided the coffee pot is the most important thing in the room. "This is for my house?" I asked. "For everyone," Brianna said. "It just helps things run smoothly." I set the notepad down. I smiled. I said, "Okay then." Raymond let out a breath through his nose. That was the moment I should have understood what I was dealing with. Instead, I let it pass, because he was my son. And I kept telling myself that sons sometimes bring home situations you didn't raise them to be in. I thought, give it time. Give her time. She's stressed. The condo fell through. She's nesting because she feels out of control. I gave her time. She used it well. By the end of the second week, the thermostat had been moved from 68 to 73. My parking spot in the garage, the one on the left side, which I had used since 1997, where the floor still had a faint oil stain from my old Buick, had been quietly claimed by Raymond's truck. My pickup was now sitting in the driveway under a cold Ohio drizzle, because as Raymond explained without quite meeting my eyes, it was easier for Brianna to get out in the mornings. I started sleeping a little less. The thing about losing ground in your own home is that nobody announces it. There's no moment where someone stands in your hallway and says, "Starting now, this isn't yours. It's a thermostat. It's a parking spot. It's your coffee mugs moved to the cabinet above the refrigerator because the lower ones were more accessible for guests. It's your name, Dad, or Mr. Calloway, or even Sir, slowly becoming just Frank, the way you'd refer to the guy who mows the lawn." One afternoon, I came in from the garage and found a man I didn't know standing in my living room holding a tape measure. Brianna was beside him, pointing at the wall between the living room and what used to be my study. "What's this?" I asked. She turned, completely unruffled. "Oh, Frank, this is Marcus. I just had him come take a look at the layout. We were thinking, if we open this wall up, you get so much more light in here." I looked at Raymond. He was standing near the bookcase looking at his phone. "Open up the wall," I said. "Just a thought," Brianna said, smiling. "Nothing decided." Marcus folded his tape measure and slipped it into his pocket and gave me a polite nod on his way out. I watched him go, then looked back at the wall. Carol and I had painted it together the spring after Raymond left for college. She'd picked a color called antique linen, said it made the room feel warm without making it feel small. I had always thought she was right. I did not say any of this out loud. That evening, I drove over to see my neighbor Hector. He and his wife Rosa had lived next door for 18 years. Hector was a retired school teacher, a man who spoke slowly and listened carefully and never told you what to think, which was exactly what I needed. We sat on his back porch with 2 bottles of iced tea. I told him what had been happening, the schedule, the garage, the man with the tape measure. Hector listened until I was done. And then he said, "You know what worries me, Frank? It's not the tape measure." I looked at him. "It's that Raymond stood next to the man holding it and didn't say a word to you." I drove home with that sitting heavy in my chest. The worst moment came on a Wednesday night, about 3 weeks in. I had gotten up around midnight, old men and late-night glasses of water. You know how it goes. And on my way back down the hall, I saw light under the door of the guest room. Their voices were low, but the house was quiet enough that words carried. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. But I stopped anyway, because I heard my name, Brianna's voice. "He doesn't use half this house, Raymond. The study just sits there." Raymond. "It's still his house." Brianna. "For now." A pause. "Once the title is in our names, we can do what we want with it. The study becomes a real office. We open that wall. We list the old furniture on Facebook Marketplace and start fresh." My hand found the hallway wall. Raymond said something too quiet to catch. Then Brianna answered, "I already talked to someone at a title company. It's not complicated. He just has to sign." Raymond, "He's not going to want to." Brianna, "He will if we ask the right way. He doesn't want to be a burden, Frank. That's the whole thing about men like him. They'll give you everything if you just make them feel like holding on is selfish. Men like him." I stood in the dark hallway for a long time. Then I went back to my room and sat on the edge of my bed and looked at Carol's picture on the dresser. It was taken at her sister's wedding, maybe 8 years before she passed. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back, one hand holding a glass of champagne. She always laughed like she meant it, like there was nothing careful about it. I said, "I think I understand now." The picture didn't answer. But I remembered something she told me once, when Raymond was maybe 14 and I was letting him get away with something I shouldn't have. She said, "Frank, being patient isn't the same as letting something happen. Being patient isn't the same as letting something happen." I did not sleep that night, but by morning, I had made a decision. I did not change anything on the outside. I did not confront anyone. I did not raise my voice. I washed my coffee cup and said good morning and went about my day exactly as I had the day before. If anything, I became easier. Brianna asked if I'd mind vacuuming the hall. I vacuumed it. Raymond needed a ride to the auto shop to pick up his truck. I drove him without complaint. When Brianna suggested replacing the kitchen faucet because it was dated, I told her that sounded like a fine idea. The more agreeable I became, the less careful they were. Raymond started leaving paperwork out on the kitchen counter. Brianna stopped closing the laptop when I walked into the room. One afternoon, I walked past the study and heard her on the phone saying, "No, we're still working on the timing. A few more weeks, probably." Meanwhile, I made an appointment with a man named Gerald Fisk. He'd been a real estate attorney in Columbus for 30 years. An old friend of a friend, steady and plain-spoken, which is what I needed. I walked into his office carrying a cardboard box. Inside were things I'd quietly collected over the previous 2 weeks. The household expectations notepad, photographed on my phone. Text messages I'd screenshotted Raymond accidentally, including me in a thread before deleting his end of it. A printout of the email Brianna had sent to a title company asking about gift deed procedures. Photographs of the house before and after they arrived. The delivery receipt for the storage ottoman and the houseplant and 2 other pieces of furniture they'd ordered to my address without asking. And one photograph I'd taken myself, of Carol's recipe card holder pushed to the far end of the counter to make room for a fruit bowl that wasn't ours. Gerald read through everything without interrupting. When he finished, he folded his hands on the desk and said, "Mr. Calloway, you're in a better position than you think." He explained it in plain terms. The house had been placed in a revocable living trust after Carol passed her idea. Actually, one of the last practical things she insisted on while she was still well enough to insist on things. I had updated that trust 18 months ago after talking to Gerald about long-term planning. The house was in the trust. I was the trustee. I had lifetime occupancy. No one could transfer the title without my explicit, unconditional consent, free of any pressure or undue influence. And the email to the title company, Gerald explained calmly, was a significant document. "Will this hurt my son?" I asked. Gerald looked at me. "Not if he makes the right choice when the time comes." I thought about that on the drive home. I stopped at a red light on Henderson Road and sat there watching a couple walk a dog across the intersection. An older couple, comfortable with each other, the way you get after decades together. The light changed and I didn't move for a moment. The car behind me gave a gentle tap of the horn. I wasn't angry. I want you to know that. I had spent some of those late nights expecting to feel angry, and instead I just felt very tired and very clear. Here is what I had learned in 37 years of working, of building things and fixing things and coming home late with sore hands. The only thing harder than building something is protecting what you built. Because the building takes effort and you remember every bit of it. But the losing happens quietly, one small thing at a time. And if you are not paying attention, you wake up one day and you are a guest in your own life. I was paying attention now. My daughter Nancy and her husband were coming down from Dayton the last weekend of March to celebrate her birthday. I had been planning a small dinner for a few weeks, nothing elaborate, just immediate family, a lasagna from Carol's recipe card, maybe a cake from the bakery on 5th. When I mentioned it to Raymond, he nodded and said that sounded nice. When I mentioned it to Brianna, she said that actually worked out perfectly. I asked what she meant. "I was going to suggest we have everyone over anyway," she said. "We can make a day of it. The Hendersons from my office were asking about meeting your family." She smiled. "And honestly, Frank, it might be a good time to get all the paperwork handled. Get everyone's signatures, make it official. One less thing to carry into spring." I looked at her for a moment. "That sounds like a lot to fit into one dinner," I said. "Oh, it won't take long. I already called Gerald Fisk's office to see if he could stop by." Raymond was in the doorway. I watched his face. He looked at the floor. I said, "Let's plan the dinner then. See how the day goes." Brianna smiled and went back to her laptop. Raymond did not look up. The last Saturday in March arrived cold and gray, the kind of Ohio day that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be winter or spring. Nancy and her husband Dale came at noon. My cousin Arthur drove down from Westerville. Brianna had also invited 3 people from her office, who stood near the fireplace holding wine glasses and looking vaguely uncertain about the decor, which had shifted noticeably since February. There were throw pillows on my couch I had never purchased. A lamp in the corner I didn't recognize. A framed print over the fireplace where Carol's watercolor landscape used to hang. I had moved her painting to my bedroom a week earlier, before it disappeared somewhere I couldn't find it. Hector and Rosa came over around 1, as I'd asked them to. Hector shook my hand and said nothing, which was exactly what I needed. The kitchen smelled like lasagna from Carol's recipe. I had made it myself. At 2:30, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. Brianna spotted it from the living room window and clapped her hands lightly. "Perfect timing." She raised her voice across the room. "Frank, your attorney's here." Several people turned. Nancy looked at me. I gave her a small nod. She had known since Wednesday. I had called her then because I owed her that much, and because Carol would have wanted her daughter to know. Gerald Fisk came in carrying his briefcase, wearing a wool coat, looking exactly as calm and steady as a man who has done this before. Brianna met him at the door and walked him toward the living room. "We're all set," she said to the room. She was good at this, the bright, efficient energy of someone who has rehearsed the moment and expects it to go her way. "This will just take a few minutes, and then we can get back to enjoying the afternoon." She reached into the kitchen drawer and produced a pen. "Whenever you're ready, Frank." I looked at the pen. Then I looked at my son. Raymond was standing against the far wall. His hands were at his sides. He looked the way he used to look when he was 16, and he'd done something wrong and hadn't yet decided whether to admit it. "Gerald," I said, "go ahead." Gerald set his briefcase on the table and opened it unhurriedly. "Before any documents are signed," he said, in his steady, unhurried voice, "Mr. Calloway has asked me to clarify the ownership status of this property for everyone present." Brianna's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Gerald laid a single sheet on the table. This home was placed in a revocable living trust by Mr. Calloway and his late wife. Mr. Calloway updated that trust independently, 18 months ago. He is the sole trustee. No transfer of title can occur under any conditions without his free and uncoerced consent. He paused. As of this month, the trust has been amended to include explicit language regarding undue influence, unauthorized occupancy, and attempts to manipulate estate decisions. One of Brianna's co-workers quietly set down her wine glass. Gerald opened a folder and laid 3 printed pages side by side. The first was a screenshot of the email to the title company. Brianna's name in the sender field. Gift deed procedures. The phrase, "working on the timing," highlighted in yellow. The second was the text thread, "Raymond's End," before he deleted it on his phone. She says, "Once it's in our names, we can renovate the whole first floor. Is Dad going to be an issue?" The third was a photograph. Carol's recipe card holder pushed to the end of the counter to make room for someone else's fruit bowl. The room was very quiet. Nancy looked at Raymond. Dale looked at the floor. Hector stood with his arms crossed, watching. Brianna recovered first. She almost always did. This is completely taken out of context. Gerald did not argue. He simply produced another page. The note from the contractor named Marcus, with my home address at the top, itemizing costs for removing a load-bearing wall between the living room and study, dated 2 weeks earlier. Arthur spoke from the far side of the room. He was 64 years old, and he had known Raymond since Raymond was born. He said, "Son, what were you thinking?" Raymond raised his head. His face had gone the particular gray of a man who has run out of explanations. He looked at Brianna. She said quietly but firmly, "Don't." He looked at me. And for the first time since February, I saw him. Not the man who had stood next to a contractor in my living room and said nothing. Not the man who had let someone else reorganize his mother's kitchen and call his father Frank, but the boy who used to come down to the garage on Saturday mornings and hand me tools without being asked, because he liked being near me and didn't know yet that someday he'd forget how. "Dad," he said. Nobody moved. I knew what she was planning. His voice was steady but barely. I told myself it wasn't going to go that far, that we'd find a place, move out, and none of it would matter. He swallowed. I let it go further than I should have. A lot further. 1. Brianna set down the pen. Raymond looked at her, then back at me. "When that guy came to look at the wall, I should have told you that day. When she moved Mom's recipe cards, I should have said something." He stopped, started again. "I was embarrassed about the debt. I was embarrassed that I couldn't fix it myself. And instead of being honest with you, I let Brianna make plans, and I told myself I was just giving it time." "Raymond," Brianna said. "No." He said it quietly, but it landed. "No, you don't get to manage this one." She looked at him as though she wasn't certain she recognized him. Gerald quietly closed his briefcase. I took a breath. Around me, the room was still. The lasagna was cooling on the counter. Carol's recipe card was back in its holder, where I'd moved it that morning. I had imagined this moment for a month. In every version, I thought I would feel something large, relief, or anger, or vindication. Standing there in my living room, with my family around me and my son looking at me with 6 weeks of shame on his face, I didn't feel any of those things. I felt tired. And I felt something that was close to love, though it was complicated enough that I couldn't call it that yet without explaining the rest. I looked at Nancy, then at Hector, then back at Raymond. Your mother worried about a lot of things near the end, I said. My voice was steady. She worried about the garden. She worried about whether the furnace was going to last another winter. She worried about you. Raymond blinked. Not about the house. Not about money. About you. I let that sit for a moment. She used to say that the worst thing that could happen to a good man is that he stops deciding things for himself. Brianna looked away. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up the household expectations notepad. I held it up. You know what bothered me most about this? I looked at Raymond. Not the vacuuming schedule, not the guest towels. It was that I raised a son who stood in the same room while someone handed his father instructions on how to live in the house his mother helped pay for, and he didn't say a word. Raymond put his hand over his face. I know, son. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. I know you are. I set the notepad down on the counter. After a long, quiet moment, Brianna spoke. Her voice was different now, smaller. I told myself it was practical, she said. That if it was going to be Raymond someday, getting ahead of it now just made sense. I know, I said. She looked up. That's the part that worries me. You convinced yourself it was reasonable. I wasn't angry when I said it. I meant it as simply as it sounded. You can convince yourself of a lot of things if you're not careful about which direction you're walking. She didn't have an answer to that. For the first time since February, she looked like someone who had run to the end of a prepared script. I looked at both of them. You have 2 weeks. I'll help with the security deposit on an apartment, not because you've earned it, but because I want you to leave and land somewhere, not just leave. I looked at Raymond. When you've gotten your feet under you, come have dinner. Not before. He nodded. Once. Without argument. Brianna picked up her pen from the table, looked at it for a moment like she wasn't sure how it had gotten there, and set it back down. The moving van came on a Saturday, 11 days later. Raymond worked harder than anyone. Brianna barely spoke. Before they pulled away, Raymond walked through the house one last time. I watched him stop in the kitchen and look at the recipe card holder on the counter. Carol's handwriting on the card in the front, her chicken pot pie, the ink a little faded now. He stood there for a moment, then he came and found me in the backyard, where I was raking the dead growth off the garden beds along the back fence, getting them ready for spring. He said, I'm going to fix it, Dad. I know you are. He looked at the garden. Mom would have had these going by now. She would have had them going in February somehow. You know how she was. He laughed once, and for a second he sounded about 12 years old. Go on, I said. Let me know when you get settled. He nodded, and he left. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in almost 2 months. I stood in the backyard with a rake in my hand and looked at the fence line where Carol's black-eyed Susans would come back in June, the way they always did, whether I asked them to or not. Some things are stubborn like that. The good ones usually are. 4 months later, Raymond showed up on a Sunday afternoon with a small cooler and a tray of Carol's chicken pot pie, his first attempt, he said, from the recipe card. He'd called Nancy to walk him through it. It was close. Not quite right, but close. We ate at the kitchen table and talked about things that had nothing to do with the last 6 months, and some things that did. He told me about the apartment, the new budget, the weekend job he'd taken until things leveled out. Honest things. The kind you say when you're not trying to manage how someone sees you. About halfway through dinner, he said, I should have just told you about the money. Yes, I said. I was embarrassed. I know. I've been broke, Raymond. I've eaten rice for a week because the furnace needed replacing, and I didn't want your mother to worry. Being embarrassed about money is not the same as being a bad person. He was quiet for a moment. What is then? I thought about it. Deciding that someone else's life is less important than your own problem. He nodded slowly. I poured us both more coffee. 2 months after that, I received a card in the mail from Brianna. No return address, but I knew the handwriting from the notepad. The card was simple, no apology that made excuses, no explanation that reached too hard. Just, I was wrong about what I thought I had a right to. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. I hope someday you'll let me try to do better. I read it twice. Then I set it on the counter next to Carol's recipe card holder and I left it there for a while before I decided what to do with it. I eventually wrote back. 3 sentences. I told her I accepted the apology. I told her trust was a longer road than forgiveness, and that I was willing to walk it if she was. And I told her that Carol's recipe for chicken pot pie was on the card in the front of the wooden holder on the kitchen counter, in case Raymond wanted to try it again and needed someone to help him get it right. These days, the garden is back. The watercolor Carol painted is above the fireplace where it belongs. Raymond comes every few Sundays. Sometimes we fix things. Sometimes we just sit. I am not a man who was too old to know what was happening in his own house. I am not a man who didn't understand what was being taken from him. I am a man who chose the moment and the method and the outcome because it was my house, and those choices were mine to make. Getting older does not mean getting quieter. It does not mean handing over the keys before you're ready. It does not mean pretending that silence is the same thing as peace. If you have ever been made to feel like a guest somewhere you built, you know exactly what I mean. I'd be honored to hear your story, friend. Take good care of yourself. Loving someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do, and protecting yourself isn't the same as pushing them away. Frank didn't win by being louder or angrier than anyone else. He won by staying patient, staying clear, and trusting that boundaries set with love are not walls, they're doors that teach people how to walk back in. Sometimes the most generous thing you can do for the people you love is simply refuse to disappear. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to entertain you while also carrying a small but sincere life lesson worth holding on to.